U.S. satisfaction is at its lowest level since 2017. It dropped 25 points over the last 4 months to only 20% of Americans being satisfied with the direction of the country.
Unbelievable. Meanwhile, Gallup reported the lowest number of people saying they are proud to be an American since they first started polling on this back in 2001. Gallup's editor-in-chief, Mohamed Younis, joins us now to discuss why Americans are upset with the state of the country. I think some of the reasons will be obvious to people, but it will be great to have you, Mohamed, dig into the data. Great to see you.
Good to see you, Mohamed.
It's always great to be back, you guys. I hope you're well. Certainly, I wish I had better news to report. But as you mentioned, satisfaction with the state of things in the U.S. is at a 4-year low. What's really fascinating about the piece Megan put out just a few days ago is when you look at Republicans' assessment of how satisfied they are, there's just this huge red drop. And basically their level of dissatisfaction or low level of satisfaction is basically back to where we were when President Obama was leaving office. That's not to say, of course, that Republicans are sort of abandoning President Trump. We also put out our approval numbers recently, and he continues to get overwhelming support from Republicans, 91% approval from Republicans. It's interesting. This last month was actually the largest partisan gap we've ever recorded in presidential approval history. And that goes back to the 40s and 30s. So right now, 89% gap between Democrats who disapprove of President Trump and Republicans who approve of him. But, the other piece to this is American pride, which is also at a historic low. Last year, we almost had the same exact headline because it just continues to dip down further into the negative territory. We've been thinking about, what is driving this? Obviously, America is going through an economic crisis, a pandemic, and a pretty serious social justice movement all at the same time. When we asked last year what made Americans proud to be American, one of the things that garnered the most support was actually science, innovation, and technology. And one of the things I'd encourage your viewers to consider is American attitudes about how things are going in the country and their pride in it could be seriously affected by how they're seeing our country manage the pandemic.
Yes.
In addition to, the race relations issues and the economic issues that are all front of mind.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Mohamed. I think it was a real, you have this idea in your head of what the CDC is supposed to be able to do and how they're like heroes and they've been preparing for this at all times and how, the vaccines and everything, all of the, great American science and technology will just come roaring to save you. Got 60,000 cases a day at this point. Didn't actually happen. Mohamed, what have been some of the most dramatic changes in your view in polling that has changed during the pandemic itself?
Well, the most dramatic thing is how people feel about the pandemic. A lot of what we're seeing now in those numbers is essentially what we were seeing at the front end of the pandemic. A lot of those graphs are actually smiley faces. So are you concerned about getting the pandemic? How long do you think this is going to go on? 7 in 10 Americans now are saying that this is going to impact their life for months or a year plus to come. At the very beginning of this, it was a minority who believed that. So perceptions of the actual impact of the pandemic are getting worse. Concerns over how it affects people's lives are getting worse. Right now, 65% of Americans say that the situation is getting a lot or a little worse with COVID. That's actually the highest we've ever captured. Back in April, it was only 56%, and now it's 65%. So we're actually breaking the record that we saw in April in terms of concern on the part of most. We do see a huge partisan split in the concern, and that's been something that's been reported on and been with us throughout the pandemic. It will be interesting to see how much that holds on if things get really worse with the numbers.
Wow.
And talk to us about the shifts that we've seen during the pandemic in terms of national pride and upset with the state of the country, and then again with the protests. How have those two pieces changed the way that people are feeling?
Well, when we've asked Americans every month, basically all the way back since the 1950s, what's the most important problem facing the country? What's absolutely fascinating is that 40% of Americans basically said that COVID was the most important problem facing the country. Right after the George Floyd incident, that essentially halved. And now 20% of Americans say that race relations is the most important problem facing the country. The last time it was that high was 1968. So that really gives you a taste for how Americans, just when asked an open question, are really harking back to some very turbulent times in terms of race relations in this country. Certainly, COVID is still just right there. They're basically tied with race relations as the most important problem facing the country. But, all of this, again, is happening in an election year. And it will be really interesting to see how attitudes will shift back and forth as the campaign gears up here. One of the huge stories of this year is how much Americans really shifted away from the election in an election year. I think that if you were in the, we're out of it, but if you're in the prediction making business, that's one prediction people would have scratched their head at, that everybody's going to unplug. Now we're seeing people really refocus on the election. We're seeing people refocus on the political discourse. The canvassing that will take place in August obviously will only drive that forward. But we're not going to take our sight off of COVID, the economic and social issues that are really tearing America apart right now, because I think a lot of the stories are really there and not so much in the election.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely fascinating, Mohamed. How do you think that this impacts Americans' desires around the election, right? So we're looking at these macro problems that people are looking at. What are people looking for to solve that? Because I think this could really undergird how we understand Joe Biden's support in the polls right now.
Yeah, I mean, what we know historically is that the two most important issues always for American voters are the economy and healthcare, in that order. So when you just think about what's happening in America today,
right.
Obviously those are going to be the things on people's minds, even more so than ever before. But that being said, Americans are overwhelmingly disappointed and, I would say disgusted with the state of politics. 6 in 10 Americans in that same Pride in America poll from last year, 6 in 10 said that the American political system does not make them proud to be an American. That's a really sort of damning statement on the state of American politics. It's important, though, to remember in America, Americans tend to be very negative on national government and less trusting of national federal government actors than they are of local government. So local government tends to have very high marks among the American public. Perceptions of corruption are very low. And it's important for us to remember that this election is also about local government. It's not just voting for president. And Americans will be, to a great degree, voting based on how local officials have handled all of these crises. What we found is that they've tended to get much higher approval ratings than federal officials. So whether it's President Trump or others, compared to your mayor, your governor, your local health officials, et cetera.
And then finally, Mohamed, you have some data specifically on how people are feeling about masks, which have become a stupid culture war issue in my view, and also how people are feeling about social distancing and whether it's being taken seriously enough. What can you tell us there?
Yeah, there's definitely an increase in people saying they're using masks. They want to see other people using masks. We're seeing an uptick in that. At the same time, I think it's really much more of a local issue than a national sort of poll can capture. We're tracking it across the country. But the real story on the masks is what's happening locally, what government is doing locally. We saw, for example, in California, Governor Newsom taking a very different approach than many other governors in other states. So we'll continue to ask it. But I think other than being sort of generally interesting, the real story is what's happening in your county, what's happening in your state, and are people going to follow the suggestions of the CDC? It's interesting to see that President Trump and Vice President Pence have certainly changed their tone on the mask issue generally in this last week.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating stuff,
Really
Mohamed. Thank you so
Mohamed.
much. Great to have you break it all down.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Next on Rising, American Prospect executive editor David Dayen. He looks at House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's origin story, how she's handled the legislative response to the pandemic when Rising returns.